April 7th, 1945. The Pacific sky burned white with sunlight and smoke as the Imperial Japanese Navy sent its final wave of airmen to die. They were young, some barely 20, flying obsolete Zeros and dive bombers with engines coughing black smoke. Their orders were simple: defend the Yamato at all costs. What they didn't know was that a small group of American fighter pilots, just a single escort squadron, was about to unleash one of the most devastating air defenses in military history. From their cockpits, the Americans could see the ocean glinting below like shattered glass, dotted with the dark silhouettes of ships and the distant blossoms of flak bursts. Radio chatter crackled with clipped, tense words. Above Okinawa, the horizon blurred into chaos as more than 300 Japanese aircraft poured through the clouds in a desperate attempt to stop the U.S. invasion fleet. High above them, the 15th Fighter Group, men flying P-51 Mustangs from Iwo Jima, locked eyes on the approaching swarm. They weren't supposed to be there that day. Their mission was escort duty for the B-29s returning from Tokyo raids, but fate and a twist of command orders placed them directly in the path of Japan's last great air assault. The pilots of the 78th Squadron, led by Major James B. Tapp, adjusted their oxygen masks and throttled forward. What followed was not a dogfight, it was slaughter on a scale never seen before. Within minutes, the sky over Okinawa became a storm of vapor trails, tracer fire, and falling aircraft. Mustang engines roared at full power as they sliced through formations of kamikazes, tearing wings from fuselages and igniting fuel tanks mid-air. Japanese pilots trained for suicide runs were cut down before they could even begin their descent. The Americans moved with surgical precision. Tight turns, disciplined bursts, and calm voices amid the hysteria of death. By noon, the Pacific airspace looked like a graveyard of smoke and oil. When the battle ended, the number defied belief. One U.S. escort squadron had destroyed more than 200 enemy aircraft in a single day, the highest confirmed tally ever recorded by such a small unit in World War II. But the victory came with an unspoken darkness. The pilots who landed that evening did not celebrate. They had seen men burn, tumble, and vanish into the sea below. For them, it wasn't glory. It was survival, and the beginning of a story the world would never fully understand. The morning after the battle, the Pacific smelled of salt, oil, and death. Rescue crews still combed the ocean, pulling charred debris and lifeless bodies from the swells. The Japanese attack had been part of Operation Kikusui, a desperate suicide offensive launched to defend Okinawa. Nearly 1,000 aircraft had been committed to the mission, each flown by men who had written their last letters home. Many were teenage cadets who believed their sacrifice would halt the American advance. Instead, they met the disciplined guns of the U.S. escort squadrons, pilots hardened by months of unrelenting combat. The U.S. Army Air Force's records would later confirm that the 15th Fighter Group, flying from Iwo Jima, shot down hundreds of Japanese planes during the Okinawa campaign, but the engagement on April 7th stood apart. Intelligence officers who reviewed the gun camera footage were astonished. Some reels showed entire formations of enemy planes disintegrating in mid-air, split apart by concentrated .50 caliber bursts before their pilots even saw the attackers. The precision and ferocity of the American counterattack suggested more than skill. It hinted at something else, something the military refused to discuss publicly at the time. For months leading up to the battle, a covert U.S. intelligence team had been studying intercepted Japanese radio codes. These ultra-decrypts revealed exact flight times, routes, and target points for kamikaze waves. The escort squadrons were being guided not by luck, but by hidden knowledge, information so secret that even the pilots themselves were never told its origin. Their commanders simply issued new flight coordinates moments before takeoff, claiming it was updated reconnaissance. In truth, they were being steered into the heart of enemy operations with mathematical precision. Back in Tokyo, Japanese Naval Command couldn't understand how their formations were being intercepted every time. The kamikaze attacks were meant to arrive unannounced, striking from cloud cover or low altitude. Yet somehow every wave was met by a wall of Mustangs already waiting. In post-war interrogations, captured Japanese officers described the day as the death of air spirit, a moment when their pilots realized that no amount of courage could overcome unseen American eyes watching from the void. What the public never knew was that April 7th marked the moment when intelligence, not firepower, decided the fate of air superiority in the Pacific. It wasn't just an air battle. It was the first time human lives were orchestrated by codebreakers hidden thousands of miles away, turning war into something cold, precise, and terrifyingly efficient. In the war rooms of Guam and Pearl Harbor, the quiet men behind those victories never fired a shot. They worked in sealed, windowless bunkers, surrounded by clattering typewriters, cigarette smoke, and endless strings of numbers. They were cryptanalysts, linguists, mathematicians, unknown soldiers of intelligence who cracked Japan's most guarded aerial codes. Among them was a small detachment known internally as Hypo-Pacific II, a unit so secret its existence was erased from post-war documents. They had broken the Z plan earlier, revealing Japan's entire naval defense strategy. Now, in early 1945, their eyes were turned toward kamikaze transmissions, coded weather reports, and flight instructions hidden in routine messages. Every time a Japanese radio operator sent out coordinates for a kamikaze launch, the American cryptographers caught it within hours. They mapped patterns, identified unit call signs, and decrypted operational ciphers so quickly that Fighter Command could anticipate attacks before they even left the ground. Orders were transmitted to escort squadrons under the guise of routine patrols, but behind every routine mission was a detailed prediction of enemy flight paths drawn from unseen intelligence. The result was a deadly choreography, a silent, invisible game where one side thought it held the element of surprise, while the other had already written the ending. When the 15th Fighter Group intercepted the April 7th strike, the timing was perfect because it wasn't coincidence. Ultra-decrypts had warned of a mass kamikaze offensive against Task Force 58. The intelligence was so specific that American planners knew the minute the Japanese formations would cross a particular longitude. The pilots who lifted off from Iwo Jima believed they were flying a standard bomber escort. Instead, they were being deployed as a preemptive strike force. In just 2 hours, the Japanese air arm lost nearly an entire generation of trained pilots. Men who had grown up believing the Emperor's airmen were invincible. In Tokyo, disbelief turned to suspicion. The Imperial Navy's communications office accused its own officers of leaking secrets. Investigations were launched, men were interrogated, and entire squadrons were relocated inland to prevent further spies. None of them ever discovered that their transmissions were being read in real time by American machines humming quietly beneath the volcanic rock of Guam. It was the perfect illusion, one that rewired the entire Pacific War. By the time Japan realized the depth of the American advantage, it was too late. The empire had already lost its wings. The psychological cost of that day rippled far beyond the wreckage scattered across the Pacific. For the Japanese pilots who survived, the sky itself became an enemy. They returned to bases where silence replaced ceremony, hangars filled with empty bunks and smoldering aircraft. Many refused to eat or speak. In diaries later recovered from crash sites, words appeared like cries from ghosts. The Americans knew we were coming. The sky betrayed us. The kamikaze ideal, the sacred fusion of honor and sacrifice, had fractured under the unbearable weight of technological omniscience. The pilots no longer believed in destiny. They believed in death without meaning. In the Imperial Navy's intelligence division, panic spread quietly. Commanders debated whether American radar had evolved into something supernatural. They couldn't fathom that the real weapon wasn't in the air, it was buried deep in the codes they used to communicate. Messages that once carried spiritual poetry and patriotic vows were now traps. Each coded order they sent out became a map for their own destruction. Still, Tokyo could not change its systems fast enough. Japan's encryption machines were obsolete, their manuals destroyed in earlier bombings. The Americans had learned every pattern, every substitution, every rhythm of transmission. Meanwhile, the 15th Fighter Group's pilots were flown back to Iwo Jima, where their Mustangs landed streaked with blood and oil. Mechanics counted bullet holes like surgeons counting scars. For the men who had fought that day, the statistics felt surreal. One squadron, 26 planes, 200 kills. It didn't feel like a victory. In after-action reports, several pilots described moments when they stopped firing, when the horror of what they were doing pierced through the adrenaline. Some watched enemy planes spiral downward, wings sheared off, trailing smoke across the endless sea. They saw parachutes open too late, then burn. One pilot wrote, "It was no longer combat, it was execution." The commanders commended their precision, yet none of them spoke of what haunted the men after. That night, on Iwo Jima, the wind carried the smell of the sea and burnt metal through the tents. Some pilots sat awake, staring at the horizon where the sun would rise again over the same killing ground. They didn't know that the next weeks would bring more, thousands more, until even their own victories began to feel like another kind of loss. In the following weeks, the skies over Okinawa became a graveyard of burning contrails. The kamikaze waves came in waves of desperation, poorly trained replacements flying outdated aircraft, fueled by little more than fervor and fatalism. Every mission was meant to avenge the last, but the Americans had turned the air war into a machine. The intelligence pipeline from Guam to Iwo Jima operated with mechanical precision. Radio intercepts were decrypted, analyzed, and converted into flight orders within hours. The 15th Fighter Group no longer hunted. It waited. And when the Japanese came, the ambushes unfolded like clockwork. The men in the cockpits began to notice a pattern. Each mission felt eerily familiar, same direction, same timing, same helpless enemy formations breaking apart under their fire. It no longer felt like combat between equals. It was as if they were fighting shadows, ghosts summoned to die. Gun camera footage reviewed in Honolulu showed entire squadrons of Japanese planes flying straight and level into the crosshairs, unaware that death was already scripted for them. Military historians would later call it predictive interception, but to the pilots it was something colder, preordained annihilation. In one encounter over the East China Sea, Captain Edwin Wright described an enemy bomber turning its nose downward after its escort was obliterated. It didn't explode. It simply dove into the ocean, trailing fire until it vanished. He didn't even try to pull up, Wright wrote later. He knew it was over. Incidents like that became common. The Japanese flyers no longer fought with the same desperation. Their movements grew erratic, their formations broke early, their attacks half-hearted. Fear had replaced faith. The once mythic courage of the kamikaze had dissolved into a quiet, fatal acceptance. By mid-April, Japan's Air Command had lost control of its own skies. Reports from surviving pilots told of an invisible American network predicting their every move. Some began to believe there was a spy among them. Others whispered that the gods had turned against Japan. The Imperial General Staff issued orders to change all ciphers immediately, but the decision came too late. The Americans had already shifted to a new phase, using intercepted data not only to destroy aircraft, but to hunt the very bases launching them. It was no longer an air war. It was extermination from the clouds, carried out by men who no longer knew whether they were heroes or executioners. By late April 1945, Japan's once proud air network was unraveling faster than its commanders could react. Airfields on Kyushu and Formosa burned nightly under relentless American raids. What few aircraft survived were grounded for lack of fuel, yet the Emperor's War Council refused to surrender the skies. They began recruiting students, clerks, and mechanics, handing them worn flight suits and a single instruction: crash with honor. The Japanese Air Force was dying, and Tokyo knew it. But for the American pilots stationed on Iwo Jima, there was no celebration, only exhaustion. The numbers no longer made sense. Hundreds of kills in days, thousands of planes erased from the map, and yet the war still raged. Inside their tents, men of the 78th Fighter Squadron read censored newspaper clippings calling them heroes. They knew better. They had seen the faces of those they killed, boys in canvas helmets, eyes wide with terror as flames devoured their cockpits. Some began keeping private journals, not of glory, but of guilt. Major Tapp himself wrote of one engagement where he downed 5 aircraft in minutes. They came apart like paper, he wrote. I didn't feel victory. just the sickness of watching men fall from the sky. These words never appeared in official archives. They were sealed, redacted, and hidden beneath layers of military decorum that demanded celebration, not reflection. Meanwhile, in Washington, intelligence officers debated what to do with the ultra-decrypts that had orchestrated these victories. The success of the codebreakers had become both a strategic triumph and an ethical dilemma. Their operations had made the air war one-sided, eliminating not just enemies but the illusion of combat itself. For the first time in history, warfare was being directed by information, numbers, signals, probabilities. Some within the War Department feared what this meant for the future. If a handful of mathematicians could determine life and death for thousands without leaving a bunker, what would the next war look like? Back in Japan, General Ushijima, commanding the defense of Okinawa, noted in his diary that his pilots fly into invisible walls. He couldn't understand how every plan was anticipated, every flight intercepted, every secret known. He didn't live to learn the truth. 2 months later, he committed ritual suicide as the island fell. The invisible war, the one fought through codebooks, radio waves, and human silence, had already ended. The rest of the Pacific would merely catch up to its aftermath. When the Battle of Okinawa reached its brutal climax in May 1945, the once mighty Japanese Air Command had ceased to exist as an organized force. The final waves of kamikazes, what little remained, were scattered and leaderless, their communications fractured beyond repair. The Americans, guided by their unseen intelligence network, now directed their fighters like chess pieces across the vast blue expanse. Each Mustang sortie was launched with coordinates that perfectly aligned with the next Japanese attempt to strike. What had begun as interception had become anticipation. For the men of the 15th Fighter Group, the missions blurred into a single, endless engagement. They took off at dawn, flew into combat, returned before sunset, and repeated it the next day. Their aircraft smelled of gunpowder and burned paint, the barrels of their Brownings glowing from overuse. Ground crews worked in silence, hands trembling as they loaded belts of ammunition into wings still warm from battle. The kill tallies painted on fuselages grew grotesquely high, so high that commanding officers ordered them wiped clean to avoid drawing attention. The War Department didn't want the public to know that one unit had annihilated nearly all opposition in the air. It was too absolute, too brutal to fit the clean narrative of valor. Among the downed Japanese planes, investigators found fragments of notebooks and half-burned letters. One recovered from a wreck near Okinawa carried a final message. "We fought ghosts. Their bullets came before we saw them." Another contained a sketch of a rising sun crossed by black lines, the pilot's final attempt to make sense of the unseen enemy. For historians, these fragments would later reveal the psychological disintegration of Japan's air corps. The pilots no longer believed they were fighting humans. They believed they were facing an omniscient force that would see through clouds and fate itself. What no one outside the intelligence world knew was that the Americans had already begun using primitive computer-assisted decoding, electromechanical machines that could process intercepts faster than any human. The information they produced was fed directly into mission briefings without revealing its source. Every flight route, every takeoff time, every radar blip was predicted before it happened. For the Japanese, the sky had become cursed. For the Americans, it had become a grid of certainty. Beneath the glory of those victories lay the first glimpse of something entirely new. War stripped of chance, guided not by courage or instinct, but by data, silence, and inevitability. As the summer of 1945 approached, the Pacific War was collapsing into a final, dreadful precision. Japan's pilots, once symbols of divine courage, were now shadows flung into the sky with no hope of return. The intelligence war had turned their bravery into predictability. Every coded transmission they sent to launch a sortie was intercepted, decrypted, and mapped to a grid before the fuel tanks were even filled. From command centers in Guam and Hawaii, the Americans watched entire formations die in real time, dots on radar screens fading one by one into silence. In those rooms, the sound was mechanical, typewriters hammering, teleprinters chattering, the hum of decoding machines. The men who worked there rarely spoke. They didn't see faces, only coordinates, headings, and timestamps. Each line of code broken meant lives extinguished far away. One cryptographer later described it as killing without feeling. He compared the work to listening to ghosts walk into their graves. None of these records were released to the public. The archives remained sealed for decades, marked only as SIGINT, Confidential, Pacific Theater. Meanwhile, on Iwo Jima, the pilots began noticing a shift. Their missions grew shorter. Enemy aircraft appeared less often, and when they did, they fought with reckless desperation. Some kamikazes turned their planes toward the sun, trying to blind their pursuers with glare. Others dropped altitude to vanish beneath radar coverage, only to be caught by American scouts who somehow always knew where they'd emerge. It was no longer a contest. It was collapse. The once living air war had turned into a slow, methodical erasure. Among the Americans, victory felt hollow. Pilots like Captain Charles Hart recalled flying through skies littered with falling wrecks, so dense the sunlight shimmered through burning fuel. He later wrote that the air looked alive with fire, and yet he felt nothing. The numbness had replaced fear. For weeks, their kills numbered in the hundreds, but the satisfaction never came. When the squadron radioed back final tallies, another 100 planes destroyed, no one cheered. The silence inside the cockpits was heavier than the smoke outside. By June, Japan's air defense network was gone. The Empire's pilots were dead, its bases shattered, its codes obsolete. Yet from Washington to Tokyo, no one spoke publicly about how it had happened. The official reports credited superior training and air discipline. The truth, that invisible intelligence had engineered annihilation, was buried under decades of secrecy. In Tokyo, the silence following the loss of the air war was suffocating. The Imperial Navy's headquarters, once alive with the rhythmic tapping of telegraph keys, now echoed with the emptiness of defeat. Officers stared at blank maps where every airfield south of Kyushu had been reduced to ash. The Emperor's aides still ordered new missions, but the orders were symbolic, words without wings. For the pilots still waiting in training camps, there were no aircraft left to fly. Many wrote their names on paper wings, setting them alight as offerings to fallen comrades. They did not know that their every message, their every hope, had been read before it even reached the front. Inside the American intelligence bunker on Guam, the final intercepts of the Japanese Air Command arrived like whispers from a dying world. The signals grew weaker, shorter, more frantic. Code groups that had once carried the complex cadence of military language now came fragmented, desperate. Coordinates sent by men who knew their transmitters were being listened to. Analysts logged each one, not out of necessity but ritual. The war's greatest secret machine had outlived its enemy. The operators didn't celebrate. They simply switched off their receivers one by one as the Pacific fell silent. Among the thousands of intercepted messages that summer, one stood apart. It was a transmission from a Japanese base near Kagoshima, recorded on June 15, 1945. The message, decrypted weeks later, contained a single sentence. The enemy knows us as gods once knew men. The origin was never traced. Some believed it was sent by a surviving officer of the Kamikaze Corps. Others thought it was the invention of a translator moved by what he read. Either way, it captured a truth that official reports would never acknowledge, that the Pacific skies had been turned into an altar of sacrifice, managed by machines and me, and who no longer believed in mercy. When the 15th Fighter Group finally stood down, their aircraft were lined wingtip to wingtip on Iwo Jima's scorched runway. Mechanics removed the names painted under the canopies, washed the kill marks from the fuselages, and prepared them for return to the United States. Official briefings described their actions as extraordinary valor. Unofficially, officers were told never to discuss the scale of destruction, the intelligence that enabled it, or the psychological collapse it left behind. Their victory, like the enemy's defeat, was meant to vanish into silence, the final censorship of a war that had already devoured truth itself. When the war finally ended in August 1945, the headlines spoke of atomic fire, surrender, and peace restored, but not of the invisible campaign that had already broken Japan before the bombs ever fell. The files on the code-breaking operations that enabled the American fighter squadrons to annihilate Japan's air arm were locked away under the new banner of national security. The name, Ultra, appeared nowhere in the official Pacific records. Even the pilots who had flown those missions were never told the full truth. Their commanders simply called it strategic guidance, a phrase designed to erase the existence of the invisible war. For decades, the world believed that Japan's defeat in the air was due solely to superior American technology and tactics. The real story of mathematicians, linguists, and machine operators who turned warfare into arithmetic remained buried in vaults beneath Arlington and Fort Meade. Only fragments leaked through. A decrypted transmission here, a forgotten journal entry there. Together, they told of men who fought wars not with bullets, but with patience, listening, decoding, predicting. They worked in silence while others died screaming in the clouds above Okinawa. History never gave them names, only outcomes. In 1947, a classified memo circulated within the Pentagon acknowledged what few dared to write. Enemy defeat was achieved through informational preemption. Tactical warfare no longer requires engagement when outcomes are predetermined. It was a statement both triumphant and chilling. The line between combat and calculation had vanished. The victory that had once belonged to soldiers now belonged to signals. The war had proved that a nation could erase its enemies before they were even seen. For the veterans of the 15th Fighter Group, life after the war carried the echo of that revelation. Some returned home to farms and families, others to jobs in the new aerospace industry that rose from the ashes of conflict. But in private letters and diaries, the same line appeared again and again. It was never a fair fight. They had lived through the birth of a new kind of warfare, one that stripped away the chaos and courage of battle, leaving behind only inevitability. The sound of engines, gunfire, and burning fuel faded into memory. But the silence that followed, the silence of knowing too much, never left them. In post-war Japan, the remnants of the Air Corps were scattered and silent. Hangars stood empty, airfields lay in ruins, and the surviving pilots returned to cities that had been leveled by firebombs and starvation. Few spoke of what they had seen in the skies. Many diaries were destroyed by families, either out of shame or fear. But hidden among the wreckage, historians later uncovered fragments that told a different story. Young men, indoctrinated to believe in divine destiny, cut down before they even left the clouds. They had faced an enemy that could see into the future, and their courage, as terrifying as it had been, was powerless. Across the Pacific, in quiet offices filled with the hum of machines long since decommissioned, the Americans cataloged every mission. Gun camera footage, once classified at the highest levels, was stored in steel cabinets that no civilian eye would ever see. Analysts had compiled kill counts, engagement reports, and decrypted transmissions, but the human cost, the psychological weight of orchestrating mass death, was never recorded officially. Many cryptographers, years later, described the experience as a moral paradox. They had saved countless American lives, but only by arranging the systematic slaughter of another nation's youth. Some of the pilots tried to reconcile it with their sense of duty. Captain Hart, writing in a private journal in 1946, noted, "We did what we were told, yet the sky still haunts me. They weren't machines, they were children wearing helmets." Major Tapp, in a conversation decades later, echoed similar sentiments. "We were trained to fight, but this was different. There was no fight, only inevitability, and that leaves a mark you cannot wash away." The secrecy surrounding their actions ensured the story remained untold for generations, leaving only shadows where truth should have been. By the 1950s, as the WWII world celebrated American air supremacy, the real mechanics of victory remained classified. Military historians pieced together fragments from logs, diaries, and radio intercepts, but the scale of the intelligence-driven annihilation remained hidden. The story of a single escort squadron obliterating 200 enemy planes in one day was relegated to footnotes, stripped of the context that made it both horrifying and extraordinary. Behind the official record lay a different reality, a reality where mathematics, technology, and human skill combined to write death into the sky with unnerving precision. In the decades that followed, the Pacific Air War became a tale told through sanitized heroism. Stories of dogfights, daring strafing runs, and the courage of young Americans facing overwhelming odds. Yet the invisible war, the one fought in windowless bunkers, over radio waves, and in the minds of cryptographers, remained buried. Those who had lived it carried it quietly, a weight of knowledge that was both proud and unbearable. They had mastered the mechanics of death without ever firing the first shot themselves, guiding an entire campaign with nothing more than paper, pencils, and decoding machines. Veterans described the paradox in letters and memoirs. Some refused to speak at reunions. Others spoke obliquely, hinting at an intelligence operation so precise it seemed preordained. One fighter pilot wrote in 1948, "We flew into skies we were told we were escorting, but it felt as though the planes were already dead before we left the runway." The truth, that human lives had been calculated, predicted, and extinguished systematically, was too unsettling for public acknowledgement. It contradicted the narrative of valor, turning triumph into a silent burden. In Japan, families hid the diaries of young pilots. Some pages were found years later describing the terror of a sky that betrayed them. Words like invisible enemy, foreseen death, and the sky is not ours appeared repeatedly. These fragments were smuggled out of archives, carefully preserved by historians who recognized their significance. They revealed a war of the mind as much as of metal and fire, a conflict where courage alone could not overcome invisible orchestration. By the mid-20th century, military theorists began to understand the implications. The operations of ultra and predictive interception foreshadowed the age of electronic warfare, precision strikes, and the use of intelligence as a weapon of mass effect. The story of a single escort squadron wiping out 200 planes in a day was no longer just a tale of skill. It was a case study in the ethical and psychological consequences of information-driven combat. Those who had survived the skies carried that knowledge in silence, aware that victory had been won not solely by bullets, but by foresight, and that the cost of such power was something the world might never truly understand. Even within the American military, the story remained deliberately muted. Reports filed in Washington described the victories in clinical terms: sorties flown, enemy aircraft destroyed, mission success achieved. But the human dimension, the eerie precognition enabled by decrypted communications, the quiet terror of pilots descending into traps they never knew existed, was absent. Commanders knew that revealing the full truth could undermine morale, provoke ethical debates, and expose the methods that would dominate future warfare. The story of April 7, 1945 became a ghost, present only in classified archives and the haunted memories of those who survived. Psychologists later studied the veterans of the 15th Fighter Group. Many exhibited symptoms of what would now be recognized as combat stress, compounded by the knowledge that their triumphs had been orchestrated from behind walls of secrecy. In letters to family and close friends, phrases like, "The sky was full of ghosts," and "We killed them before they even knew we were there," appeared repeatedly. These admissions were never published, never acknowledged by official historians. The air victories were celebrated, the pilots decorated, and the technology praised. But the moral and emotional toll of orchestrating death through invisible channels remained invisible. In Japan, the surviving pilots and officers carried their own silence. Many committed ritual suicide or disappeared into the ruins of cities bombed flat, leaving behind only scraps of diaries and letters. Families preserved fragments, often unaware of their significance. One recovered diary recounted, "I flew to meet the sun, but the bullets found me first. I felt eyes in the sky, not human, watching, deciding. There is no glory, only inevitability." These testimonies, once dismissed as propaganda or poetic despair, were later confirmed by cross-referencing, intercepted transmissions, and U.S. operational records. They revealed a war in which strategy, intelligence, and technology eclipsed courage and chance. The day a single escort squadron destroyed 200 planes was etched in history as a feat of tactical brilliance. Yet beneath the public narrative lay a far darker story, of invisible eyes reading codes, of young men sent to die with precision, and of victory achieved not solely through combat, but through anticipation, calculation, and an almost mechanical orchestration of death. For those who lived it, and for the generations who would later uncover its truths, the Pacific Air War was not a story of simple heroism. It was a story of ghosts, mathematics, and the unbearable cost of foreknowledge. By the time the war ended, the skies over the Pacific were silent, yet the echoes of that day, the slaughter orchestrated from thousands of miles away, resonated long after. The American escort pilots returned to a world that celebrated their courage, but knew nothing of the invisible mechanisms that had guided them. In their private journals, they recorded the same haunting truth. Victory had come not just from skill or bravery, but from a network of unseen eyes and minds that had predicted death with terrifying accuracy. The men who fell from the skies on April 7th had no chance, not because they lacked courage, but because they were playing a game whose rules they could never see. In the decades that followed, historians pieced together fragments of the operation, intercepted transmissions, classified reports, and diaries from both sides. The story that emerged was almost unbelievable. A single squadron, guided by intelligence and cryptography, destroying 200 enemy planes in a single day, rewriting the course of the air war over Okinawa. Yet official accounts, sanitized for public consumption, portrayed it as a conventional aerial engagement, a tale of skill and bravery rather than the chilling precision of foreknowledge and unseen calculation. The legacy of that engagement remains a cautionary shadow over modern warfare. It revealed the power of information as a weapon, the moral ambiguities of controlling life and death through intelligence, and the psychological scars inflicted on both sides. The pilots of the 15th Fighter Group lived with it silently. The Japanese airmen who survived carried trauma and resignation that could never be fully documented. The truth existed in hidden bunkers, encrypted files, and fragments of burned letters, memories that were never meant for the public eye. April 7, 1945, was not just a date on a calendar. It was the day the Pacific Air War became a testament to the deadly convergence of technology, intelligence, and human will. It was a day when courage collided with inevitability, and the sky itself became a theater of unseen forces. The world remembers the names of pilots and squadrons, but the full story, the orchestration, the calculation, the ghosts in the clouds, remains buried in silence. And perhaps in that silence, the true horror and brilliance of what occurred can finally be understood. That war, in its most absolute form, is not just fought in the air, but in the minds that see what no one else can.